Welcome to Cannon Chapel. I'm Angie Stryker. I'm campus minister at Bread Coffee House. Thank you. This is not about me. We are here at the Veritas Forum tonight. We're so excited to be here. This is sponsored by the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life. Easy for me to say, right? Kevin's here. Hey, Kev. Hey, Kev. And RUF, where's Stephen and Laura and the gang? Hey. As well as InterVarsity, we have Glenn and Clement. Hey. All right. So welcome to the Veritas Forum. Yay! Tonight, our forum is entitled God, Self, and Mental Health. A Yale scientist and Emory psychologist discuss. We felt like as campus ministers, this was a great place to start on this campus. It's a discussion that we're having in all of our campus ministries, and we hear on campus all the time. And so we thought it was really important to get together and do this. And we have a sign. Yeah, Clement? Woo! I'm sure you all know this because you're smarter than I am. What does Veritas mean in Latin? Truth. That's right. So tonight we're here for a real discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and our deepest beliefs. We've asked our presenters to share personally, to ask honest questions of each other, and model a conversation that all of us can continue this evening and beyond. That is our deepest hope, that later on your conversations will go back to this very moment, and that something will have clicked for you. We hope that you will leave this room challenged as well. So we create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs. That is what Veritas does. And guess what? We need your help. So you got a little postcard in your hand. It is a 60-second survey. I want you to start filling it out. Even if you don't have a pen, steal your neighbor's. It literally only takes 60 seconds. This is how we make these forums better and better and better. Spend 10, 15 seconds on the first part of it. I think there are questions you can easily answer. When you're finished, we're going to have a reception downstairs, and this is your ticket to all kinds of delicious homemade treats, veggies, and coffee, decaf, and regular, okay? So that's your ticket. All right, so for now, I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. First, we have our moderator, Dr. Claire Galloway. Yay. Dr. Galloway grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, y'all. She recently defended her Ph.D. in psychology in the neuroscience and animal behavior program here at Emory. She's continuing her research at Emory as a postdoc fellow, contributing to a project that uses, this is going to be hard for me, optogenetics and in vivo electrophysiology to study how stimulating one brain region enhances the function of a downstream brain region, the hippocampus, to improve memory performance in rats. This is the kind of language I use every day. But we're so glad you're here. Thank you. We have our presenter, Dr. Nii Addy. Dr. Addy is an assistant professor. Yes, go ahead. Whoop it up. Woo! He's got cool YouTube videos, y'all. Check it out. Dr. Addy is an assistant professor of psychiatry and of cellular and molecular physiology, as well as a research scientist at the Yale School of Medicine. He received his Bachelor of Science from Duke in 2000 and his Ph.D. from Yale in 2007. His research examines the neurobiological mechanisms of reinforcement learning and motivational control and seeks to identify how these mechanisms are altered in psychiatric illnesses such as substance abuse. Thank you for being here tonight. And we also have our own presenter, Dr. Jane Yang. You may recognize her. We're so glad that she's here with us tonight. She's a friend of mine on the campus. She's the associate director of outreach and consultation services at Emory's CAPS, so that's why you may recognize her. And she's a licensed psychologist. She's a counseling psychologist by training and earned her undergraduate degree here at Emory and her Ph.D. at USC in California. In her role, she works with students, faculty, and staff to increase CAPS' connection to the larger Emory community and is especially passionate about supporting students who hold identities and backgrounds that have been historically marginalized. So y'all give it up for our presenters. We're so glad that they're here tonight. Without further ado, Dr. Addy, please come to the stage.
Well, thanks for that generous introduction. It's great to see such a nice turnout. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. I'm actually just glad that I got into town, to be completely honest with you. It's been a little bit of a journey between everything I've heard about the I-85 adventure, I guess we'll call it that, and all the weather that you guys had yesterday. There were actually a bunch of delays coming out of Connecticut this morning, so I was glad that I was able to get here in one piece. So thanks for having me. Also feel very welcome. You may have heard in my introduction that I did graduate from Duke University. I did meet a UNC graduate today, Clement, and he still welcomed me here. So for any of you who follow sports, you know that can be a contentious issue as well. So I have to say this is a very good sign for how we're starting out. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. I think this is a really timely topic that you all have come up with, and I hope that we'll have some great conversations that won't just be limited to the conversations that happen tonight, but it was, as already mentioned, it will extend beyond this evening as well. So this is something that I've talked about in public forums and public settings in the past. You heard in a little alliteration to some, or a little shout out, I guess, to some of the YouTube videos. So fortunately for all, this isn't something I'm doing for the first time. And sometimes when I give these talks, I'll have students who will come up to me and say, well, how did you get comfortable talking about these things in a public setting? You seemed pretty confident in what you were saying. I have to admit to you that it wasn't always the case. So I'm going to share with you one story of a particular instance when I was an undergrad. I think it was in my junior or sophomore year at Duke. And I was actually already involved in some research in the classroom, or research in the lab. So basically what we wanted to do was to go out into the community and try and engage a lot of elementary school students to try to get them thinking about research and things like that. So in one instance, we went to a particular fifth grade classroom. And so I was working in a lab that was doing some work with nicotine. We were doing things with substance abuse. And I was trying to get these kids to think about the fact that you can take medication that can change how your body reacts. So if you have a headache, you might take a painkiller, those sorts of types of things. But unfortunately, the types of words that I used to describe some of these situations probably wasn't ideal. So we were basically standing in front of the classroom. I had all these fifth graders looking at me with rapt attention. The teacher was in the back of the room, not paying any attention to me whatsoever. And the first question that I asked the students was, how many of you have ever taken drugs before? And all of them just stared at me. The teacher, who hadn't been paying any attention, all of a sudden looked at me like, what is this guy doing? I'm sure at this point they had already been trying to tell the kids, don't take drugs, they're not good for you. And now you have this college student coming in and asking all these kids if they've taken drugs. So hopefully I've gotten a little bit better about my word choice over the years. You guys can give me feedback as we go through and let me know if that's indeed the case. Hopefully it will be the case since we're still talking about some of those same research topics today. But in truth, it is good to be here, and I do really enjoy these types of conversations, so I'm looking forward to the conversations I'll have with Dr. Yang and to hearing the feedback from you all as well and hearing your questions. But before we get into that, I did want to give you a little bit of a background about my particular approach to mental health, both from my faith perspective and in terms of how I approach it in a research setting. So as you've already heard, I run a research laboratory in the psychiatry department at the Yale School of Medicine, and I'm a neuroscientist by training. So most of what I do within the laboratory is trying to look at things from the perspective of the brain. And if I were to give you kind of an overarching theme of what we study in the lab or one of our main perspectives or our main goals, I would summarize it this way. So basically what we're trying to do in the lab is to try and understand what processes in the brain actually influence complex behaviors. Now there's a few different reasons why we're interested in that. One is just from the perspective of if we can understand what happens in the brain, we can get a sense of how that influences behaviors in normal settings. So thinking about this all the way from the animal kingdom all the way up to humans. But the second reason that we look at that is that there are, of course, lots of different changes in behavior that are associated with different mental states and that are also associated with mental illness. So if we can try and understand what's happening in the brain to influence these behaviors that are associated with certain mental states and with mental illness, we might be able to take a peek and actually get an understanding of what is causing some of these illnesses in the first place. So a word that people often use in the field is thinking about etiology. So what is the cause of the disease? And so we're trying to get a sense of some of that cause by looking at these behaviors and what's actually causing those behaviors to occur. So as you may already have heard heard or seen through the website or other aspects, basically the two things that we're particularly interested in are substance abuse and depression. So if I were to ask you just to give me examples of particular behaviors that are associated with substance abuse, besides the drug taking itself, what are some of the types of things that come to mind? Go ahead. Risky behavior? Yep, that's a great example. Any other thoughts, ideas? Impulsivity? Yep, another good one. Mm-hmm. Yep, isolation is definitely another piece as well. Yep. Yep, exactly, exactly. All great examples. How about two more examples? That's a great one. One more thought? Go ahead. Paranoia? Yep, so you're all hitting on some great points. So a lot of these different behaviors that you can already hear in some of these topics that people have brought up in some of the feedback that are associated with certain types of behaviors. Now, would you say that all of these behaviors are particular only to substance abuse, or would you say that some of these can be extended to other areas of mental health as well? Any ideas? How about I lead the question a little bit? So what other types of mental health illnesses or other mental health issues do you think some of these similar types of characteristics that you all have already given me might apply to, besides just substance abuse itself? Go ahead. Yep, depression is a good one. So thinking about things like isolation, that's definitely one that comes into play. Yep, that's another good one. Yep. So I think, yeah, go ahead. Exactly. So I think what you can already appreciate is that a lot of the things that we're talking about are not just specific to one specific mental health state. And so again, for us, if we're trying to think about what's happening in the brain to cause or influence some of these behaviors, it might actually give us insight into multiple types of certain mental states and multiple types of mental health illnesses. So one of the pieces that we look at in the laboratory in particular is this aspect of relapse. So that's one of the key pieces that we look at when we're thinking about substance abuse. And the reason for that is that, of course, it's one of the debilitating factors that prevents people from actually successfully stopping using a specific drug or substance. So we've had conversations with people that might say they've moved away from their home environment for a certain period of time. They might go to a treatment facility, and they might do well in that facility. They might be clean for a period of time. And this can go on for a period of years. But oftentimes, if a person goes back to their home environment or gets in a particular situation where there are certain cues or people that they associate with drug taking before, just being in the presence of that environment, they can start to have a lot of these cravings again that used to be associated with the drug taking, and eventually they can relapse into that drug taking. A lot of times I've heard people describe that as having a desire for your favorite food, but multiplying that sensation by 1,000. So a really deep and intense craving that these people have, and that can be debilitating in a lot of instances. So a lot of what we're trying to do in the lab is to understand what's happening in the brain that's actually allowing that craving to occur. And if we can understand what's happening in the brain, are the ways that we can alter that response in the brain to actually try and decrease that behavior and help these people have a better chance of success in terms of drug cessation and not relapse into those particular situations, again, that can be debilitating in a lot of ways. So the other piece and another aspect that we've started to look at more recently, as I alluded to, is depression and anxiety. So if I were to ask you the same question as I asked before, what are some of the behaviors or characteristics that you would say are associated with depression and anxiety? An idea over here? Lack of interest? Yeah, great example. Fatigue? Yep, another good example. Go ahead. Yep, lack of interest, as someone mentioned. Yep. Go ahead. Say again? Suicidal thoughts, yes, yes. Exactly. Apathy, yep, another good example. Loss of sleep. Yeah, so you all are hitting on a lot of good points. So you can see a lot of these have aspects of people removing themselves from certain situations that they would once have been involved in more heavily, more regularly. So there again, too, we're asking ourselves, what are the certain changes in the brain that are actually influencing some of these behaviors that could be contributing to some of these disease states and some of these alterations in mental health? So what I've highlighted so far in all the examples I've given you and in talking about my work in particular is a lot of these biological components. As I'm sure many of you have already heard in coursework, probably going all the way back to high school, is this interaction that occurs between the biology and the environment. So the genes, as people talk about, or other aspects of biology, and how that influences and interacts with the environment. So if I were to ask you what particular aspects of the environment or what types of characteristics can contribute to different mental health states, both good mental health states and not so good mental health states, what are some things that come to mind initially? Childhood development. Can you give a little bit more detail about what you mean by that? Right, right. So the quality of that development, whether it's positive or negative, and how it influences mental health. Great example. Go ahead. Hmm. Right, right. So she mentioned the exposure to pesticides that can influence. And there you actually have an example where you have interaction between both the environmental exposure and what that does to biology. That's a great example. Hmm. Social climate. Yeah, that's a great example. Can you give me a little bit more detail about how that might influence? Right, right. So mentioning people that you're surrounded with and how that influences some of these aspects as well. It's a great example. Yep, go ahead. Hmm. That's a great example. Yep. Yeah, yeah, another great example. This is great. So you guys are definitely thinking about a lot of these topics already. And so you can see, even in what we've highlighted so far, that there are lots of different aspects that can contribute to mental health. And one of the pieces that I want to emphasize as well is there are multiple types of environmental factors. So we've talked a lot about a lot of the social factors that can come into play, aspects of identity, but there are also socioeconomic aspects that can come into play, aspects of racial identity that can come into play, and then ways that these pieces can interact. And from a faith perspective, I would also say that the spiritual environment that someone is raised in or the spiritual perspective someone has can also play a critical role in some of these pieces as well. And again, with all of these things, I think the critical piece here is that it's not one particular aspect that is driving the whole thing, it's the integration across all of them. So I've already highlighted and started to allude to the interactions between the biological components and these environmental components. But I think oftentimes, or in some instances, we try to isolate them and think about them individually, but it's also important to think about how all these different pieces integrate. So how does for instance, if I talk about someone's family history, that's a good example that doesn't just refer to the biology in terms of someone's genetics, but also refers to the environment that someone grew up in. What are the types of activities that are happening in that environment? What's the racial climate in which that person grew up in? How do they identify with people from different races or with certain things that are happening in the world around them that can also influence people's mental health state? So for me, as a researcher, even though we're focused on the biology, I'm always trying to think about how that fits into these other aspects. And then as a professor and as a mentor and an advisor, as a husband, as a father, I'm also thinking about all these other aspects that interact with these pieces as well. And then from my perspective as a Christian, I also take into account the spiritual component as well and think that is also a very critical component. So there have been a lot of studies that have looked at aspects of spiritual practices, whether someone's involved in the faith community, aspects of mindfulness, and there is evidence that a lot of those things play a critical role. But I also say that I would take it a step beyond that not just the spiritual practices themselves, but as a Christian, I would say the fact that there is a God who has created humankind and is invested in human lives, that there's an all-powerful God that continues to interact with us and continues to influence aspects of mental health. So while the spiritual practices are good, I'd take it a step beyond that and say that it's God actually working in people's lives through these different aspects as well. And again, highlighting that this is also a piece that's interacting with all these other components that we've taken into account. So I hope this is something that we'll really talk about as we go through the conversation tonight. One more piece I did want to mention on the spiritual piece itself, especially as a Christian. So as a Christian, one of the core beliefs is in Jesus Christ being sent to the earth to come to save mankind, and also believing in the evidence that Christ was raised from the dead. So obviously that's a very powerful statement and a bold statement to make. But if I were to take that a step further and to say, if there is an all-powerful God that can raise Christ from the dead, then yes, I think that God can also be deeply involved in aspects of mental health. So I'm really looking forward to these conversations that we're having tonight. Looking forward to hearing your all's thoughts on all those different aspects and how all these things are integrated, and hopefully it will be something that's a fruitful conversation for everyone that's here. So thanks so much.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Addy. That was awesome. I'm Dr. Claire Galloway, as I said earlier, and I'm going to be moderating the next part of this forum, which will be an interview with Dr. Yang and Dr. Addy. We're going to go through a few questions, and then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So if you guys are ready, we'll just get right into it. This first question has a little bit of a preamble, so just bear with me. But In a recent op-ed in USA Today, there was a Harvard public health professor, Tyler Vanderweel, who talked about how religious participation can benefit both your mental and physical health. And there's a quote from him that I'll read. The research at Harvard and elsewhere indicates that possibly due to a message of faith or hope, those who attend services are more optimistic and have lower rates of depression. The research from Harvard has also shown that attendance protects against suicide. At the same time, though, we have incoming freshman surveys across the United States that indicate that the proportion of students who are in a religious affiliation is decreasing. So do you think that a lack of religious community is contributing to mental health challenges among students today?
So, in considering this question, I think that the first thing I'd like to say is I think broadly, lack of community, period, is really compromising the mental health of students today. And I think community broadly, in terms of figuring out where they fit and who they connect with. In addition to that, I do think religious community can be very important and protective. I also think that coming to college is a time when students are really exploring for the first time what they believe outside of their parents' home, right? So figuring out, who am I? I grew up in a certain religious or faith community with my parents, with my family, and now I'm at college. What is that going to look like? And so I think that in terms of considering mental health, that there can be a lot of challenges in terms of finding the right faith community when students come to college. So I talk to many students who struggle with maybe gravitating towards a religious community that is the same denomination as the one that they grew up in. But now that they're at college, they don't necessarily feel like it's the healthiest community for them. And how do they permit themselves maybe to explore other communities of faith?
I think that's a great point, and I agree with the importance of community in general. And so I think also a lot of the examples that you all came up with in terms of thinking about depression, you were highlighting the fact that there's a lot of isolation that's involved. So when people are struggling with depression, sometimes they tend to pull back and remove themselves from certain situations. So again, having a strong community can be protective for that aspect as well and important. I don't know if I would say that the lack of religious involvement is causal to having more mental health challenges, but I would say that there's a connection there and it can be protective as well in the same way. And again, thinking just about community in general, that a lot of these pieces can be protective. But then also thinking again with this whole integrated mindset about what types of communities are people involved in. So community can be protective, but it can also be problematic. So depending, a clear example that I could give is again going back to the whole idea of substance abuse when you have people that are relapsing. So someone that might be hanging out with a new group of people and then go back and associate with someone they used to hang out with in the past that then leads them into a direction they didn't want to go to. So in that sense, having a strong faith community and other communities as well can kind of help protect against that and continue to steer people in the right direction.
I think another aspect of this, as you were talking, I was thinking about also what it means to be part of a religious community or a faith community, and receiving the right kind of support from people. And so I think for a lot of students that I work with, especially those who have a strong faith life or religious life, that while many times that's very protective, at the same time there is a subset. And what they talk about is the struggle that they experience in allowing themselves to even ask for help because of beliefs that asking for help indicates some sort of lack of faith. And that these may be messages that they hear from their religious communities, that they're not praying hard enough, or that they need to be more faithful and continue to wait for an answer to prayer that looks a particular way, and that may impinge upon their ability to go seek help.
Yeah. So I think that's a really great point as well. And I feel like I'm probably going to say this too many times tonight, but then going back again to this whole interactive aspect. So it's important not to get stuck in only one piece of that. So your example about if a student or an individual is told they're not praying hard enough, the prayer piece is important and powerful, but you wouldn't also ignore the counseling that can happen, or if someone should or should not be on medication. So kind of, a more humorous example I always give is if someone, if someone had an accident and broke their leg, they wouldn't only pray over their leg and say, why isn't my leg getting better? I prayed over it. they would also go to a doctor, they might need to get a cast. You know, there are other aspects that also need to be done at the same time. So we don't always treat mental health the same way, but there are a lot of similarities there too. So if someone is struggling with mental health, there are certain practices that should be put into place. The person should go and seek help and not only just focus on one aspect. And so that can be an important piece as well. But then you have to be in a community that is going to actually provide that support and acknowledge that piece and not say, I mean, people have often shared stories where someone has said, I'm a Christian, I can't get depressed, or I shouldn't get depressed. And those are the types of comments that don't help on any front and don't acknowledge the real issue that might be there that really needs to be addressed. So.
Yeah, great.
So I think both of you touched on this a little bit already, but how do you see stigma and shame factor into how people understand and also experience mental health?
So I would say stigma and shame, just those two words together, right? If you think about those words together and you think about what it means to really relate to other people, there's probably no greater way to shut down a conversation than to inspire feelings of shame in somebody, right? And so I do think that when I think about issues of mental health in particular, that stigma and shame really interact to shut down dialogue about what mental health is, about what it means when someone's struggling, and as Dr. Addy was saying a minute ago, even the way we think about mental health, that it's not necessarily seen the same way as a physical illness, although we have a lot of research and biological evidence, right, that there is a health or a physical component to mental health. And so I do think that they play a really crucial role in terms of the narratives that communities create and in terms of shutting down people's ability to really acknowledge what might be happening for them and also with helping them get help.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in a lot of instances it prevents people from being able to move forward to get the help they need. And I've seen students try to combat that in a lot of ways. So at the graduate student level, there are multiple students who have sought out different mental health services, and now to the point that when incoming students are coming in, they'll actually make the point that this isn't something that you should avoid, that if you need to get this help, there are great mental health services that are available, and kind of encouraging other students to be willing to have those conversations. Because what you don't want is a situation where someone feels that there's a stigma associated with it, then they're not addressing it, and some of those instances or issues can get worse over time to the point that people are having much more severe anxiety or depressive episodes, whereas if some of those things could be addressed early on, if people didn't have as much of a hesitation and were encouraged to take advantage of some of those opportunities beforehand, that would have been better. But I think we still have a ways to go in terms of reducing some of that stigma.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also, you know, there are some communities in which the stigma is higher, right? And that's related to history, that's related to the social and cultural factors. And so there's a very legitimate history of suspicion related to what it means to get help for mental health reasons. And so I think it's not just about changing the narrative in the community, but I think it's also about having adequate and appropriate resources that are culturally affirming for communities.
So empathy is a vital way that we understand and interact with other people, especially people who are our friends who are struggling with mental health issues. So can both of y'all talk about how your worldview helps you find empathy towards others, especially those who are suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd say as a Christian, that's a critical component of the gospel message. Going all the way back to the initial example that I gave of Jesus Christ coming to earth and having empathy for people who are struggling. I mean, you can find lots of examples of that throughout the Bible. So I think it's a critical component in terms of my worldview as a Christian, and it's also part of my worldview as a biologist. So I could even give you biological examples from studies that have been done in animals that show aspects of, you can debate whether or not it's empathy or not, but when you put animals in group situations, how that improves their overall behavior and their overall state in a sense. And even when we're thinking about some of these things like depression-related behavior or substance abuse. So in a lot of the work that's done in the biological fields and the animal work, a lot of that you'll see there's improvements in terms of maybe improvements is the right word to use, but the animals will actually take more drug or do better with administering drugs of abuse if they're in isolated situations. So the minute that you start to put social interactions in that piece as well, that can actually protect against some of these substance abuse taking behaviors, that can protect against certain types of risky behaviors. And so from animal models all the way up to humans, there's lots of different examples that kind of emphasize and highlight the role that empathy plays. And then again, getting back to the spiritual components as well, I think it's a critical component. And we've, in a sense, been alluding to that through the conversation already.
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything you said, and the things that I would add in terms of my own worldview and experience, I think not only as a Christian, but also as someone who's Korean American, and by virtue of that fact, I come from a very collectivistic family, right? And so something that's really been instilled in me is this sense that we all belong to part of a community, that we're all tied together. And, you know, I think back to the most profoundly positive experiences of my life. And those are those moments in which I felt very heard and understood by others. And I think about the work that I do here on campus with students, and not just therapy work, but also community work. And the work that I find most rewarding for me is the work in which I experience this connection, right? And what I see in the students' faces is that experience of you get me. And the more I see that, the more that sort of affirms and reinforces the power of empathy, the power of being heard.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, racial and ethnic identity is an important factor to how we construct our own identity. How do you think that the reality of a racialized society is impacting mental health of students today? And how do you think that we can grow in our ability to relate well across racial and ethnic differences?
I think it's definitely impacting things. I mean, I can highlight a lot of different examples over the last year, but I think it's also revealing a lot of underlying tensions that have been around for years that are now coming to the forefront, and that can be challenging from a personal standpoint, can be challenging from a community and collective standpoint. And I think a lot of the challenges that are coming out are just manifestations of that. And so that actually gets back to this idea of empathy as well. So I think with some of those things, you have what many people, including myself at times, are perceiving as a lack of empathy. And so in those instances, those can make it easier for people to fall into certain situations that make them feel uncomfortable or anxious. And at the same time, sometimes it actually puts a greater stress on the need for community, whether that's a faith-based community, which is important, as I've mentioned before, but then also aspects where people are trying to reaffirm their community within certain racial ethnic groups, because some of the challenges that come up are more easily identified in those types of situations and circumstances. So I mean, personally, I've had lots of conversations with students over the years that have fallen into these aspects of racial identity, and then being, as a minority scientist in an environment where there aren't as many minority scientists, that I can give lots of clear examples of where that allows people to have, again, that sense of community as someone they can relate to and to address some of these issues that are coming up as well. So I think it's a critical component. I don't think we've figured out yet the best way to address all of those pieces. I guess the silver lining for me, in a sense, is that at least in this political climate, there's a lot more conversation that's happening. So my hope is that that won't just get stuck in conversation, that will actually turn into action and people actually investing and making improvements. But I think that's something that needs to be, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I agree. We've come a long way, but there's a long way to go. And I think that, you know, in addition to all of the things that Dr. Addy mentioned, there's also this, the reality of the impact of social media and the constant ability to access information, but then also the constant bombardment of information. And so I think that, you know, when I'm talking to different people about their experiences, and a lot of the work I do is with racial ethnic minority students, much of what they talk about are some of the very things Dr. Addy's talking about. Their experience at a predominantly white institution, and also their experience not on an everyday level, but also in terms of what the system is doing or not doing to support them. And so I do think it's really critical that the dialogue is happening, but that dialogue has to be followed by some sort of positive action, positive response, in order for us to really adequately support our community here.
So what is your understanding of hope, and how does it factor into the conversation surrounding mental health?
I think hope is hope and faith, right? So tied together biblically. But I think for me, in these moments when any person is really broken down and they just reach out that one hand for help, and in desperation, right? For me, that's an indicator that there's some grain of hope left alive in that person. And I think that it's really important for us to be able to recognize when that's happening, because sometimes it's very obvious and other times it's not. And so for me, I think that when I consider hope, it's really about these moments, or that tiny light that we all have inside.
I think that's a great example as well, in terms of, especially within aspects of people being willing to reach out. I think hope itself can extend across multiple levels as well. So part of it, again, for me, goes back to this idea of having a community, that there are people who are being supportive of an individual, and that can give an individual something to hope for. Part of it goes back to the faith foundation as well. So thinking about hope in terms of things that happen beyond this world. So the ultimate hope of a better life after this life. And just all those pieces that kind of start to interact. But again, thinking about the fact that sometimes when people slip into things of isolation and depression, then a lot of those perspectives get lost in the shuffle in terms of hope. So I think there's so many important ways that we need to be able to remind people of these opportunities. And one of the things that I often emphasize with students is to just try to continue to stay in touch. So make sure you keep me up to date, continue to stay in touch, and just keep those conversation lines open, or make sure they're talking to people that can help them keep that perspective of hope, because oftentimes it's easy to lose sight of those when you start to slip into areas of isolation. So really having other people around you that can remind you of those aspects of hope, and hope for better things to come even while we're here on this earth. Just having those inputs constantly kind of as a reaffirmation of those pieces.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point in terms of, when people are really struggling, having people around them who can hold that hope for them, but then also sort of the perspective of a grander plan for each of us, and really keeping in mind that all the pain that we experience in this world, that there is a greater plan for each and every one of us.
So we're about to move on to the question and answer session, but before that, I wanted to give you guys one opportunity to talk about what advice you may have for students who are either know a friend or are personally struggling with mental health issues.
I think for me, the advice is twofold. One is when you're ready to talk with them, or if you're the person who's struggling, and when you're ready to talk with someone, to really create space to listen, number one. The second part of this is, as you listen, to really try to understand and to think through who and what your allies and supports are. Because as we've been talking about tonight, really all the work that we do is within the context of community with each other. And so it's really important for each of you to really be aware of who your resources are.
Those are great points. A couple of points for me as well. So again, thinking about this as a neuroscientist, one of the things that I often try to drive home is to try and remind people that there are aspects of the brain that are involved. So those aren't things that we should ignore. So a lot of times I think some of that feeds into the stigma. And so one thing I've tried to do over the years is just to try and this isn't a science talk per se, but to try and oftentimes highlight the things that are happening in the brain that can facilitate or help people to slide into some of these challenging mental health states, and to really emphasize that there are things that still need to be, that can be corrected and improved and influenced. And I would segue that into say that one of the pieces is, again, to try and help people move beyond this stigma and to say, oh, there is something here that needs to be addressed. And so I would agree with the points that you have made. If you're the person that's that someone is sharing with, to really be that advocate and be that listener. And I also say for individuals that are struggling or have struggled and moved on, to also be willing to be an advocate for others. So I think there's a very powerful piece in that as well, for someone to be able to say, I've struggled with this too, and these are the resources that I was able to take advantage of, and this is where it brought me. That can really help bring people from this place of feeling like it's a stigma to realizing, oh, there's someone else who's gone through this too, and oh, there are certain things that they were able to take advantage of, or certain things that they realized that helped them along the way. So being willing to pay it forward in that sense and not keep it to yourself.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. Can we give them a round of applause? Okay, so now if any of the audience members have questions, Kara will bring a microphone to you. Please just raise your hand and I will call on you. And I just ask that the questions be pretty brief so that as many people as want to ask questions can.
Hi, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm Lois. Am I limited to one question? Okay. Okay. So my one question is, I'm in a public health school, and we saw this graph that I don't know the source of the graph, but like it said, like over the last few hundreds of years, the record shows that I think like infectious diseases and like a lot of the other types of diseases have been reduced, but mental health diseases have increased over time. Is that like, what do you guys think about that? Is that like an accurate portrayal of reality, or is it bad data collection?
Well, I'd need to see the graph to know for sure and read the study, right? I wouldn't necessarily want to criticize someone's work without taking a look at it myself. I think what you're speaking to is the reality that because infectious disease is something that is perceived to be very scientific, that it in many ways it's more acceptable to focus on infectious disease and fighting it, right? Whereas over time, mental health and combating issues related to mental health is something that's been highly stigmatized and often ignored. And so in that vein, it wouldn't entirely surprise me that what we would see over time is that the numbers appear to be increasing, also because as stigma reduces, more information comes out, right? But I'd want to take a look at it before I would say anything about the quality of the data.
So I don't want to put you in a box, but I'm just curious. I've heard some things that sound like epiphenomenalism, some things that sound like interactionism, and I'm just curious if you have an opinion. What is your opinion on where the self lies or like resides, and how that impacts how you view mental health?
So,
Good question.
so when you say where the self lies, could you elaborate a little bit more?
Like physical, spiritual, mental, psychological.
Well, it's really interesting because even the way that you're asking the question is from a very Western perspective, right? And so in that way, it's very culturally bound. And so keeping that in mind, can you repeat your question?
What are your thoughts on dualism, and how does that influence how you view mental health?
Mm-hmm. So I think as Dr. Addy was sharing, I think that we are all whole beings, right? And our beinghood is comprised of our spiritual selves, our mental selves, our physical selves, all these different aspects of self. And so for me, when I'm working with anyone in terms of thinking about their mental health, just as Dr. Addy was talking about the research, really I'm looking at them in the context of being a whole person. I don't know that I would necessarily separate out any aspect of a person, because I don't think that's how we're really created.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And getting back to the whole idea of integration and all of those composed of the self. But I would also say that, especially when we're talking about mental health, there's certain things that could happen at different levels that could influence how someone views themselves or their concept of themselves. So I could give you examples of specific manipulations we could make in the brain that would influence someone's behavior. That I could also give you examples of specific changes in upbringing that could influence someone's idea of themselves or behavior, or specific aspects of their relationship to God that will influence how they view themselves. So all these pieces can all influence that view of itself. I still look at it kind of as a holistic integration across all these different aspects, so much in the way of what Dr. Yang was referring to. So that's a great, challenging question, though.
That is a wonderful and challenging question, and I feel like I could probably talk to you for about 8 hours.
Hi, I'm a neuroscience major, and I'm planning on going into substance abuse research. And I'm anticipating working like in a clinical setting, so with alcoholics and opioid and cocaine abusers. So, what's the best way to approach like neuroscience, substance abuse research with spirituality and community in mind?
That's a good question. I'm going to start by saying I don't think there's one answer to it. It depends on, and part of it depends on which aspect you want to focus on. So there's a lot of the work that I do is focused on the basic science and what's happening in the brain in animal models all the way up to humans. Then there's also the clinical pieces of that, and then all the way going up to more epidemiological types of things. So I guess the question I would throw back to you in terms of, so you're trying to think about how to integrate a faith perspective into your approach to treatment or into your approach to study, or? So I might let Dr. Yang touch on the interacting with people part. Not that I don't know. That's a little bit of a cop-out.
He doesn't
I interact with
people at all.
animal people. But in a sense, for me, it has to do with my perspective in each of these situations. So obviously, if I'm doing experiments with rats and asking them if they're relapsing, I'm not going to ask them what their spiritual approach to that is. But when I'm having conversations with students that are struggling with certain issues, or so one example, when we give our lecture to the medical students about substance abuse, we'll often have a patient that will come in and talk about their experiences as well. So the nice thing about that is it highlights a lot of the biological components that we've talked about, but then it also talks about their lifestyles, and a lot of times those individuals will also talk about their faith perspectives as well. So for me, it influences how I approach each piece and give me a context for all of it, but it might not have a direct application in each specific instance. But I'll let you maybe talk about how that might work in the clinical.
You answered that very
setting.
well. I think the only thing I would add is it sounds to me like part of what you're getting to is if you're someone who's working in the sciences, perhaps, how do you integrate the side of yourself that also is spiritual and has a faith life or a religious belief, right? And this is something that I hear a lot actually from Emory students. They talk a lot about how it feels to them like their religious or spiritual beliefs or faith life don't necessarily feel connected to their academic work. And I think probably the simplest way to answer your question would be to say, I think that so much depends on relationship and trust in life, right? And I do think that for many of us, we have different values and perspectives, and those are related to faith life, but also to other things about who we are. And so for me, what I would encourage you to do as you move forward is really to, as you develop relationships with people, think about where it fits for you, to maybe bring different aspects of who you are to the room. And I really encourage people to take their time to figure that out. Because not every environment you enter is going to be one that's trustworthy. And so it's important to take care of yourself in that.
Hello. I know you mentioned specifically your sort of connectedness to your identity as a Korean American, and I'm someone who's studying mental health in Japan, and so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to sort of the interesting phenomena that happens in a society that is so collectivist, but also people experience so much isolation in mental health. So I do understand what you were saying about community, but also in my experiences there and in my studies, I found that there's really a large isolation where people feel that they can't speak to their community about these problems.
Right, because of the high levels of stigma.
Yes.
Right. So I think that that is a very complex question, much like the question that was asked from this side of the room. But I do think that we've alluded to it today, right? Which is in every cultural context, the way that we create language for mental health issues is different. And so what I really think about are finding culturally congruent and culturally affirming ways to create dialogue. I think it would be presumptuous of me to hand down some sort of, like pragmatic rule as to how to do it, because I'm not there in the culture, really looking at what each of these individuals is grappling with. So for me, I feel like I'd want to know a little bit more, and so I feel like the fairest answer to give is that one.
Hi, my name is Chloe. I just had a question. I've been having a lot of conversations with people recently, and we've noticed this kind of paradox in college where there's kind of this objective, like increased quality of life for some people, in the sense that you have more autonomy to choose the people that you're around, to choose your classes, to kind of choose to surround yourselves with the things that make you happy. And yet, at least the research that I've looked at shows increasing rates of depression and suicidality among college students. And I was just wondering if you had any insights into what might be causing that in the college population specifically.
There's much speculation about all the various things that could be causing that. And I think that, much of what we've talked about tonight is related just in terms of thinking about the sense of community that people feel, especially as use of technology is so high, and how, while use of technology is not negative in and of itself, I think when there's a high reliance on it, that what it can sometimes block is sort of the tangible human connection, right? So that's one thing that's talked about. Other things that are talked about have to do with sort of the larger socio-political or socio-cultural fabric, and there's a lot of speculation, a lot of thought about what it could be. But I think from my perspective, in terms of meeting the students here at Emory, the things that I see here at this institution really have to do with the feelings of isolation from others, high levels of academic-related stress, high levels of pressure really contribute to a lot of difficulty just in terms of people being able to be what they consider to be their best selves.
Well said.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I was wondering, what would you say to somebody who's dealing with some very deep mental health issues and finds himself very angry with God because of that?
Good question. Yeah, I'll start.
Okay. Taking up a lot of the floor tonight.
I'll pull it back.
I think relationship with God is very dynamic, just like human relationships. And I think a lot of times well, I know that at least I grew up in a faith community in which anger with God was not really a permissible sort of feeling, right? But I don't know that in my own life experience or study that I found that I believe that necessarily to be true. And so for me, I think what I would probably do in talking with this friend is really wanting to understand more about their anger with God, really wanting to understand what's been happening for them, and then going from there.
Yeah, I would agree as well. And a lot of it, I think, comes back to some of the conversation that we've had already in terms of being that advocate and that listener, so being willing to be available for that person. So I've had people share those types of sentiments with me in the past. I think some of it is just trying to understand what the root cause of those thoughts are, but then it also is complicated if someone is indeed struggling with some of the mental health issues that may be intertwined with that. So I think some of that comes back to the conversation that we've already had about making sure that we try and help remove the stigma and make sure that people have those resources, but then also giving people spaces to kind of work through some of those pieces. And some of this, I guess, also ties into just what resources people have at their disposal. So a lot of times people will go to a counseling service for counseling services, or they may go to a spiritual advisor, but that doesn't mean the spiritual advisor always is necessarily grounded in counseling per se. So some of that is knowing the best types of people to go to, and there are definitely individuals with spiritual counseling that have some of those experiences as well, but some of that might be trying to help someone in this situation find a counselor who has both those aspects, who can actually help someone walk through some of those details. But that's not always an easy situation or a person to find, I would say.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing up the resource piece as well. Emory is a very well-resourced university, right? And so I think that if there were some discomfort with reaching out to my office, then, we work very closely with the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, and I think that anyone there could also provide some guidance in terms of thinking about next steps and best connections.
Hi, I'm Monica, and my question for y'all is what sort of advice would you give to college administrators, professors, and student leaders for fostering positive mental health as a campus culture?
I think a lot of the comments that we've brought up already tonight could be reiterated from administration. Not to say that administration doesn't. I don't have a sense of the administration here as much, but that's something that can be affirmed from the top down. So really, again, removing the stigma and making sure that people know that these services are available, I think, can be a critical step. Not necessarily to improving mental health, but to at least try and help people who might be struggling, or even help people become aware of these things before they might be struggling. So I think just, again, emphasizing that these pieces are available and then showing some of this empathy as well. So a lot of times I could give examples of situations where students have been struggling with mental health issues, but then feel that certain administrators aren't sensitive to that or are only making it more difficult. So again, really reiterating that administrators are here to provide support and to walk with the students through certain situations, even if there's a mental health piece that's involved. I think it's really critical for people to sense that the administration is there supporting them in whatever challenges they may be going through and really guiding them towards the right resources. And from what I've heard, it seems that there are definitely ample resources here for dealing with those things.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I smiled as you asked the question because these are the sorts of dialogues I have pretty much every week, if not every day. And I think one of the big points that I've really been emphasizing with administrators, but also with students, is that our community's mental health is a community responsibility. It's not just one office, it's not just one group of people, it's everyone's responsibility. And so it's really important for us all of us to be invested in that process and to co-create it together.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, individually about your standards for mental health, or like what the ideal is, both like from a Christian perspective and from a scientist's perspective, being like maybe normal biological behavior, and also just from like as a like psychologist from a cultural perspective. So all these different standards for mental health and like how you define illness, and if you've seen those clash at any point.
It's a very big question. Great question. I guess I can start. Which piece should I start with? So I'll try and integrate as I go through. I guess that's being consistent with all the stuff I've said so far. So I would say that a lot of it has to do, so there is no, I mean, people have these conversations about the quote-unquote norm. I think that can be helpful, but it can also be dangerous as well, and there are lots of different examples I can give you of why that could be dangerous. But I would say in a lot of instances, so if I go to depression, for instance, so a lot of times what people will talk about, both in the animal literature and with humans, is whether people are susceptible to certain types of depressive situations in the midst of stress, or if people are resilient. So everybody experiences stress. It's a natural part of life, but not everybody will respond to a stressor in the same way. And you can see that if you do animal studies as well. So some animals might look resilient, some might look more susceptible. And so part of it is trying to understand what helps people have good coping strategies and be resilient in those instances. So there are certain biological components that we've been able to identify that help make animals resistant. There's certain practices that people can be involved in, and some of those biological components that people can be either naturally have in their biology already, or through medications be pushed towards that can help them be more resilient in certain circumstances. So I'd say a lot of it has to do with what works in those certain circumstances rather than what's quote-unquote normal. Again, because it's such, even if I talk about just the biology, there's so many different components involved, so many different components in the brain and the body that can influence how someone might be either susceptible or resilient. And so there isn't one quote-unquote right way, or one biological component is the right way. But from a spiritual perspective, I would extend some of that there as well. So there are a lot of practices, I would say, and some of the things we've talked about, being involved in the faith community that can make someone quote-unquote successful in these certain circumstances. So I would say a lot of it is having, in terms of my conversations with people, so if people are in fact believers in God, and trying to think about having them know and affirm the worth that God's already given them, and having that help them through these certain circumstances as well. So again, it's not, I feel like I'm not giving you a lot of concrete pieces, but partially because it's so individualized, but I'm saying there's a lot of different ways that I think people can successfully manage some of these pieces. And hopefully that example of the susceptibility and resilience at least gives you a little bit of a concrete sense there.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think the piece that I would add is that, as Dr. Addy was saying, really, we're not robots, right? We're unique individuals. That's how we were made. And so I think that what that means is that what normal looks like for each of us is very subjective. And so part of what I challenge anyone to think about is really what's my normal, and is my normal sort of consistent with my values, with the life I want to be living. And then if there's a deviation from that doesn't feel so great, right? Thinking about, as Dr. Addy was alluding to, what are some supports I have? And that may be, faith community, it may be mentorship, it may be medication, it may be therapy, it could be a lot of things. But I think also figuring out how far away do you have to be from your normal before you decide to get that help. So I'd say that'd be the thing I'd add to what he shared already.
As an undergrad, I've really only had the opportunity to be part of the Emory community and to see how that is involved with mental health. And so I was wondering, like, especially if you know any institution-specific challenges that people come up against, like at Yale or any of the schools that you attended as a student or in your career, or just if you guys know any differing.
When you say institutional challenges, what do you mean?
Well, you talked about like the stress and pressure of Emory, and it is kind of a question I've always wondered about because everyone always says that Emory is so stressful, but I obviously have no idea what another college would be like, and if they would have many of the same challenges, or if they would be the same degree, or if you would have a different social challenge, maybe. Just if you guys had any experience with that.
I mean, I think, yeah, it can vary by university. It can also vary by discipline, I think sometimes too. So I know when I was an undergrad, some of the engineering disciplines had certain cultural aspects associated with them where people would just be up all night all the time. That's an exaggeration, but it seemed that way. But there were certain cultural aspects that seemed to be associated with that specific discipline where there was a certain approach that people had to that discipline. So I think it can span across majors as well, but yeah, it definitely varies by university. And each university kind of has its own culture. I mean, we were actually joking a little bit before about the culture at Duke and UNC. I think a lot of ways the athletic culture there is an outlet for people. So in some ways, this is not scientific by any means, but I think that the basketball culture in some ways is very helpful in distracting people from all the other stressors and things like that. So I think each place kind of has its own culture to it. So I think a lot of the challenges, a lot of the academic challenges can be similar when you talk about similar types of institutions, but the way that individuals in the student body deal with them can differ slightly.
I have nothing to add to that.
Did that get at your question somewhat? It's a tough question. It's a good one.
Hello, you talked about the influence that a religious community makes, and Dr. Addy, you laid out the gospel. So are you seeing that when people are saved, they're healed of mental illness or substance abuse, or they're just better at being depressed, or better at not drinking and doing drugs? I mean, what does that mean when you say that?
Yeah, that's a good question. A good question and a complicated question. So I think it provides an additional source of hope, an additional resource, and I would say one that's true, but it doesn't cure things in the sense that we still live in a world that has a lot of challenges associated with it. So in the same way, I would say, not exactly the same way, but if someone was dealing with a congenital heart issue and is a Christian, they still may have the congenital heart issue that they're dealing with. But then there are also instances where people have had prayed over those things and have been miraculously healed. So I would apply that to mental health as well and say there are situations where people will still be struggling and may have a resource, but there are also instances where people have had miraculous healings. So again, trying to think about the fact that mental health illness does have also a strong biological component to it, even though there are these other integrated aspects, but I would treat it in much the same way I would treat some of these other illnesses and challenges that people have.
We have 2 more questions.
So my question is, so in the university setting, we have students from different faith backgrounds, and even in Christianity itself, it's very diverse in terms of beliefs, and each individual has different beliefs. And usually, when you're pretty young, in your 20s or in your teenage years, people tend to question their beliefs or change their beliefs. So as a counselor in the college setting, what kind of guidance would you give to a student who needs support and is also changing their religious support system? Because it can be helpful in terms of dealing with depression and stress, but it can also be the creator of mental illness, depending on the background that you grew up in, and depending on whether or not you have strong personal beliefs or personal relationship with God. Some people might be reluctant to break away from a bad religious environment. So how do you navigate that? And also there are some people who suffered from mental illness who believe that it really doesn't exist in the brain, but it exists in the social environment, and then if you change that, then depending on type of mental illness, that can change it. So those are 2 questions. what are your comments on those questions?
So for me, I think a lot would depend on the actual person, right? And what I often will talk with people about as they negotiate these things is what they want to do and what they're ready to do. And I think it's really important when people feel oppressed to do something, to really think about what the impact of that's going to be on them, including on their mental health, and really thinking through and preparing for all those potential impacts. And so for me, I'd really want to, unless there's something life-threatening happening, what I'd really want to do is slow down the process and understand a bit more about what the impacts on that person are going to be and how we can prepare for all those things.
Last question?
Hi. So mental illness is something that's often stigmatized, and some people don't think that it's real, but it's something that's biological. So how would you go about convincing people that it's something that's not, I guess, fake and just a social problem, but also something that's like biologically rooted?
Yeah, so it depends on the specific type of mental health challenge that you might be talking about, but I could give, I mean, there are lots of examples, even with depression per se, that could illustrate that point. So if you manipulate certain molecules or receptors in the brain, that can influence a person's or an animal's behavior in either a more, like this resilient versus susceptible type of thing. And there are certain examples, genetic examples as well. So if people have certain genetic backgrounds, they may be more or less susceptible to certain types of mental health illnesses. But that, of course, still interacts with the social and psychological environment that they might be in. So again, it depends on which type of specific mental health illness that you're talking about, but there are clear examples in literature that can show that this specific modulation of this receptor, for instance, can change someone's response. And also in terms of treatment as well. So if someone's saying, they don't think that this has something to do with something that's happening in the brain, there are examples of treatments that will change responses in the brain that will then improve people's mental health outcomes. So I'd say, I could give you some specific examples as well, but those types of conversations I think can be helpful in those instances.
I think research and data can be helpful, and then I think also about knowing your audience. And so it may be that this is not a dialogue that's going to lead where you want it to, right? A lot depends on the people involved. And so I think having a sense of who your audience is and what will resonate for them is also really important.
Okay, thank you guys for your questions. We're about to close, but before that, I wanted to give Dr. Yang and Dr. Addy just one more opportunity to kind of give maybe a final thought that you would like to offer the students or faculty that happen to be here.
Well, I appreciate your engagement and all your questions. It's been a really lovely experience being here with all of you. And I really hope that as each of you moves forward, that you find your place of community, wherever that is.
Yeah, I would agree. It's been great to be here, and I really appreciate how candid people have been in terms of the questions that they've asked. And I would just reiterate one of the points I've already made in terms of thinking about these in terms of the whole person. So there are specific components that are important, but definitely thinking in terms of this as the whole person and being willing to address each of those components without fear of stigma, but really being able to take all those pieces into consideration as you move forward. And hopefully, as I said before, these conversations won't get stuck here tonight, but will actually continue beyond this room as well. So thanks for allowing me to be involved.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Galloway. Thank you, Dr. Yang. Thank you, Dr. Addy, for coming all this way. We appreciate you being here. Give them a round of applause again, please. Our prayer is this is only the beginning of these conversations, and we will discuss more over delicious desserts downstairs, coffee, decaf, and veggies as well, if you're watching your waistline. We'll have a chance to talk about it some more. Also, 60 seconds, y'all. Fill it out, finish it, That is all. Thank you for being here at the Veritas Forum.